Hello, 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 hello. All staff should be moved up because you're going to be part of this conversation. Welcome, everyone, to the WestSide Wastewater Treatment and Resource Recovery Select Committee meeting. You have an agenda in front of you. There are a number of items under new business, and I think that's really it. So if I could get a motion to approve the agenda as written.
So moved.
Okay. Thank you. Any discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? None. Motion's carried. We have the minutes of November 5th. I need a motion to adopt those minutes. Seconder, please. Any errors, omissions, or changes? Thank you. Any other changes? Seeing none, I will call the question on the minutes as amended. All those in favor? And none opposed. Motion's carried. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming out to Colwood. this is an important meeting. It's moving ahead. We're now past elections, so we know who's sitting around the table, who will be sitting around the table. We did invite Mayor-elect David Screech. He was unfortunately unable to attend today due to another commitment, but we hope that he will be attending soon, and alternates will be able to be chosen. I want to let you know that we are being recorded on this meeting, so you need to use your mic. It's not a live broadcast, but it will be helpful in the minutes, and in our effort to be open and transparent, this is part of that process in terms of being able to go forward. I want to welcome Amy Dennett, who is here from she's reporting for the Martlet, which is you, Vic, is it? Thank you very much. So a first member of the public and media, so we best be on our best behavior. And just in terms of just first glance at this, I want to express certainly my appreciation as a co-chair for the inclusion of the Lekwungen translation. And I hope that, Ken, you'll be able to say to us how we express these words. As we maybe can you tell us right now, so we're saying these words. Asiem nushal nasha. Is there anyone else?
I went to one of our elders, and this is how I was told put it down, and I've also passed on the translation to Christina.
Okay, so at some point we'll get the proper pronunciation. So that. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So those are my remarks. There are no presentations or delegations, but before we go on, I would ask the committee to consider a motion to allow staff to participate in this meeting. They are our advisors, and we need their assistance. So these are staff from our municipalities. So thank you. Thank you. Any discussion on the motion? All those in favor? Any opposed? None. Motion is carried. All right. So we will be looking to you for your thoughts. We have now, we'll go on to the budget update, and Diana Logan will provide some information to us. This is as per our motion of the last meeting. Thank you. I'll turn it over to you, Diane.
Oh, sorry. I put together a bit of a handout based on the pre-discussions that we had, and after we had some of the discussions, I was asked to sort of start back with how we got to where we are in terms of the cost sharing and the participation in the sewer. So I'm starting with the cover sheet there. Back in 2007, we really got going with the order to start doing sewage treatment. We engaged a consultant to aid with putting options together and to do to cost out a lot of the various options. And we started having meetings with the committee. That's a core committee and staff from the various municipalities. We had numerous meetings with finance, engineering, and administration staff from the municipalities, and we also eventually had meetings with the municipal councils. We had meetings as a subgroup, as individual councils. We had meetings with all of the councils. Having been invited to the board, we gave them dinner and worked to engage with the participants that would be in the service. While that was going on, we were working with the various areas on the capacity that they wanted and and sorting out what the benefit for each jurisdiction was. The basic cost sharing in the service is design capacity benefit, and because of the way costs come together for sewage treatment, and because that is the bulk of the cost, when the calculations were done, the design capacity benefit came out to be represented by 70% of the dry weather flow and 30% of the wet weather flow, and that was based on the requirements for the construction of the plants, with a smaller allowance for piping, which is actually wasn't in the plan that's come together a big cost relative to the actual variety of treatments. The provisional capacities were put together by the engineering staff, and I've personalized all of your copies. And if you look in your copies, you'll see there is a letter that would have been to, and I'm speaking to the staff that received them, and to the council members. You'll see a letter that was written to someone in your staff, giving an update on the flow sheets. And it's not my intention to go through all of the items in the flow sheet, but rather to show you, and here we don't have View Royal, so I'll share View Royal here. So what the staff did was they looked at the OCPs, the regional growth strategy, the flows that the municipalities had at the time, because we had measured flows, we have measured dry weather flows, measured wet weather flows, and we also have water consumption numbers for the municipalities that helps with trending as well. And the engineers put a lot of this material together, and they did some trending, and we also mapped out sewered areas and non-sewered areas and areas that potentially had growth, and the engineers also did charts where they showed the variability of the flows over the months, and as part of doing the calculation on how much capacity, all of the flows were converted into population equivalents. So they had numbers for how much flow a person would use, and most of the municipalities had the same approximate flow. And then for all the other uses, industrial and commercial, they had calculations for converting their utilization into population flows as well. So that gave a common unit to use when comparing the various jurisdictions. We then went through these with the staff from each municipality. We had individual meetings. The engineer went out and helped the various staffs to review the material, provided more explanation on what the material meant, how it could be part of the input on how much capacity the municipality would be using, and also talked about attributes that could reduce what would have been the typical predicted volume capacity. So pointed out the low flow toilets and the change for washing machines, etc., and gave those as sort of hints for the municipalities on items that they could take into consideration.
Anna, I'm just going to interrupt you. You're talking about municipalities, but can you also be inclusive of First Nations?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we did the same for the First Nations. So the purpose was to aid the municipalities in coming up with what they thought their capacity would be. At the same time, there was discussions going on with the senior levels of government on what they were prepared to do in terms of grant funding. And initially, we had Infrastructure Canada and the province of BC at the table, and the expectation was that Infrastructure Canada would be the sole funder from the on the federal government side. The province and the feds eventually clarified for the group that they were not funding growth. The reason they were putting grants into this project was because it was a built-up area. This was one of the last areas to be sewered that was built up, and so their funding was for the existing population with a minimal provision for growth. So although the engineers had started out looking at 2065, they backed off to 2030 as the year for the flows, because that met the parameters. Mike, could you pick this up en route? That was the parameters that the province talked about. So there were many different plans that were put together, and what the letters that you have are attached to the flow sheets are not the first distribution. You'll see in most of them, you'll talk about why things were revised. They were individual to each jurisdiction, because this was an iterative process. At the same time, the core committee had agreed to support a subcommittee for the West Shore, and there was a sub-project that was done looking at the Colwood and Langford having their own plant. When that was concluded, the decision of that subcommittee was to go back and to say no, we would really be rather part of the main project. So we were back again with one project for the whole region. As time went on, there were some changes that were happening in the municipalities, and there were opportunities. So Colwood, for example, had city centre on the horizon. They were looking at developers doing sewage treatment potentially for them. So they were cutting back on the capacity that they thought they needed in the plant. There were many iterations that the engineers went through, that the politicians went through in terms of the configurations for the plant, the volumes, and when we were finally close to having a project, having narrowed down and sub-narrowed down on various projects, the capacities had been reduced to where it was possible to, with a wet weather plant at Clover, and the province had agreed to that, and with the reduced flows coming from the jurisdictions, the treatment plant that was proposed to go into McLaughlin, in fact, would fit the flows that were needed, and the second plant that had been looked at and potentially would have been at Harrow Woods was turned into a holding tank to level out the flows. So there were many, many different attributes going into it. All along, the staff were working with the staff in the municipalities and checking in from time to time with the core area committee, and as I say, there were numerous meetings that went on with the councils as well. So by the time we were ready to tie the grant funding down, the federal government did not have enough money left in their Infrastructure Canada program. And so we had a consultant in Ottawa that helped, and were able eventually to find 3 different envelopes for the project. Nobody at the senior level was signing on to a grant until there was a firm project, which is why this took so long. They wouldn't set funds just blindly aside. They wanted a specific project. They wanted the liquid waste management plan, and they wanted siting in the liquid waste management plan. So when that was done, we ended up with 3 different grants. It's a melody of different cost sharings, different criteria within the grants, but they all average out to a third, with the CRD participants having some costs that are 100% theirs, such as the cost of land in the project. So we ended up with the flows as they had come from the municipalities and the design capacity benefit. There also was an agreement that was consistent with the bylaw on the ability for capacity to transfer from one jurisdiction to another in the future, if there was agreement on that, and an agreement that it wouldn't be a horribly outrageous price to do that. It was to have not. The object was to end up with a purchasing jurisdiction having the same costs as they would have had when they had been, if they'd been in at the very beginning and paying a nominal interest rate up until the time when that transfer happened. So that's sort of the story on how we ended up with the grants in the way that they are, and how we ended up with the flows having been worked with and originated as best we could with the municipalities and the First Nations. I did attach here in the second page a schedule that has been distributed before, and there the provincial grant is pretty simple. It's got it's for the whole project. It stipulates they pay nothing until until the entire program has been constructed, has been commissioned, and is able to meet the environmental criteria that the province put in the agreement for resource recovery, etc. And it basically wraps around the provincial grants. So some may say it's not as specific as a federal program, but in fact it wraps around the federal program. So it is built upon those different cost sharings in the federal grants. So we have 3 grants. I've just got a high-level summary there of what the deliverables are, and those are quoted from the grant documents themselves, and what's required for any changes, and the effective dates for costs that are theoretically eligible under the grant programs. We have received no funding from any senior level of government for the expenditures after these dates were incurred. We did get a preliminary, very unusual $10 million planning program approved as a grant, and the province and the feds each paid a third for that, and that was to help get the CRD and the CRD municipalities to a point where there was a program.
Is everyone on the same page? We're now at the financial plan page. Do staff have this information as well? Okay.
So I've gone through the overall summary. You've got copies of the flow sheets there, and this was the summary for the grants. And now I'm going to speak to the subject in a more detailed way with fine print here on where we are with the budget. So the budget to date, we've now got the CTERA program itself at the top, and that is a program that under the agreement with the province must be administered by a delegated commission. The committee and the board have no jurisdiction on how they were implementing. They were to implement consistent with the requirements in the grant agreements, whether they're 3P or design build. There are varieties of conditions in those documents. So for the expenditures to date on the program that are in the main CTERA project have been $39,482,000, and that is what comes under the budget of the $787 million for that project. Now, that's funded from a variety of places. We have some borrowings that have been done, and we have the funding that's come in on the annual contributions from the municipalities, and we have some temporary borrowing. Because of the uncertainty of where we are right now with the program, we have held off on doing a lot of long-term borrowing, and are have very good rates for temporary borrowing, and that's where we are there. A piece of added information on here is the planning phase, which just says that was a $10 million project that was over and above this the CTERA program. And then at the bottom, actually, I got more clarification from yesterday, and these costs at the bottom are costs that are that the CRD has incurred that are outside of the CTERA program and are non-shareable. So we do not have included in these numbers the $17 million for Viewfield, because Viewfield was acquired in order to have more than one site to look at for the energy center, and staff were unable to get an option on the site, and took forward to the core area committee that the only way they could see having a secondary site on the table going out for consultation was to actually acquire that site, and then if that wasn't the site, that site would be sold. So we have just paid for that, but that is now being paid for out of the basic sewer budget and not the CTERA program. It's not part of the program, it's part of the sewer. We've parted with the $17 million for that, and we have a commercial lease that is about $1 million for the next year. So we're getting funding, reasonable revenue on that land. We've also entered into a contract with a realtor that the board and the committee endorsed, where we are looking to either sell that property or to enter into another commercial lease. So we're looking at both options, the idea being to minimize the cost or maximize any extra funds that come in from that transaction. So that's happening on the side here. So as a little bit of extra information for the budget, there are two more things in your package. Attached to this is just on the second page of that is just a summary of a little bit of a description on the service that runs the existing bylaws that you share to date, so they include the cost for planning. And then on the last page are the percentages that each of the municipalities is paying right now. And the CTERA program is the last set of numbers, so that is 3.798C. That is the CTERA program cost sharing. Now, this is a cost sharing for the municipalities, does not include the cost sharing for the First Nations. The municipalities are taxing for the funding, and or they have a utility fee structure for the funding. The First Nations, in the previous cost sharings that we've had with them, have come in with a cash payment. So, for example, the Songhees have been paid for the review of under the liquid waste management plan by providing a cash payment to the CRD, and we drew that down as the rest of the group were spending money, so it came down in their proportionate share. And when other pieces of infrastructure, larger pieces of infrastructure have gone in, the request has been to be able to make a one-time payment. And I know in the discussions that I was at the Songhees, which were not all of the discussions, but in those discussions I did talk about the option to participate in a borrowing and be billed for that, or to have a lump sum payment that we would calculate that would represent their share. That funding would be additional funding that would come in, and what that would do is it would either reduce the last ramp up in the last year of the program, because their flows are the lower flows. It's smaller geographical areas, and so we would ensure that all the cost sharing is all adjusted appropriately, but give them the option to look at those various ways of funding it, and to give them time to talk with INAC and whomever there. For one last piece of information, I attach the Sierra program and budget update number 17. This is the overall budget that we have for the existing program. And you'll see there's some annual flows. You should find the whole program mapped out there, and that is what we have in our budget. The reason we have that in our budget is because we have a liquid waste management plan, we're raising funds, we have an order to do something, and as things change, we will adjust it, but we have to have something in our budget for the coming year. So that's sort of the documentation that's here. If the result of these of the work that the municipalities are doing now results in a different configuration, if we end up with 1 or 2 or 3 different kinds of configurations, well, we would be back to design capacity benefit. And the design capacity benefit would be calculated based on whomever is participating in a standalone infrastructure. And we would then, if we have extra funds on hand, we would look at those funds, but we would again do the accounting that's required in order to adjust funding to date and the billings for future funding based on whatever those subcategories are. And so I've been asked, how much money do you have? Well, you each have what you have paid in to the existing project so far, and the funding that has come in so far is not enough to cover all of the costs to date. So if everything canceled today, you would still owe money. Now, we would borrow that money, or you could pay cash for that money, but there is no surplus funds. That doesn't mean we can't make funds available. So if this group is looking at something like $400,000 to do a package of work on this program, on the accounting side, what we do is take about $1.6 million out of the group funding. So those groups that aren't participating in this, we would put their money in reserve for those municipalities, noted with the amount for each jurisdiction, and that way the program itself would continue to have money that is funded on a uniform basis. So we've certainly done this kind of accounting before. We've had projects start down one way and then shift to another. We've gone back, put it all together, done prior year adjustments. So I guess it's a plus and a minus. The service bylaw is set up to provide for lots of variety in terms of collaboration and joint ventures, but that means there's calculations for all kinds of different pieces of infrastructure. And that means the moment you change something, if there's a material input that changes, that means the cost sharing gets recalculated. So that's I hope I covered some of what you had asked.
Yes, thank you.
Cover?
What I would like to do now is, in recognition that this was requested by Mayor Young, who is not here today, it's my intention to guide you to tabling this at some point. But because we have people here, I want the opportunity to be able to ask the questions. It may be that we need you to come back again, but we won't need as much detail next time. I just thought it was, the co-chairs actually thought it was really important that people sitting at this table get some of this information. You've received a very thick package that you're trying to listen to and absorb. So I don't think that we should make any decisions on this other than to bring it back. But I do want to open it up for questions. So, and this is also included for any staff questions that may come out of the paperwork as well. They may come up later as well. So we're fine with that. Questions? Judith.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And I certainly appreciate the opportunity to table, and I'll support it because, as you say, we've received a lot of information, and certainly, Diana, appreciate you bringing us, taking it through it, but it is a lot to absorb, and there's a lot of little figures, and you know, and I'm sure everybody else around the table would sort of appreciate the chance to kind of look through it and more properly understand it. You've answered a number of questions, so I think one of them is we are all of us collectively as municipalities kind of contributing into the CRD, but if I heard you correctly, right now we're behind the 8 ball, so we've spent more money to date than we've contributed to date.
That's correct, and we expected that. So we have a borrowing bylaw, and we are using temporary borrowing under that bylaw. So we have funding for everything. What we haven't done is to convert a lot of long-term debt, in particular because of the uncertainty. So we changed our plans on how we would be bringing the funding forward in the summer as we were getting ready for what we were going to do in the fall.
So help me then understand a couple of the go-forward pieces. So if we end up, and I'm kind of using the CRD-wide or the core area-wide, yes, big we, end up with multiple plants, a couple of questions. One is, to what extent do we all still have to go through the Cetera process? Is that still going to be a requirement of the provincial funding?
Okay. That is a requirement of the provincial funding, that whatever happens, that is done by a delegated bylaw, a delegated commission, and when the board and the committee, who struggled, they wanted more. The committee wanted to have more input into what happened, and they wanted to have more decision making, and sent back numerous proposed changes to the province, and the province rejected them. And so what they have right now is the bylaw that was negotiated between the two parties, and it is a condition. So I cannot see, we have had no indication from the province that they would let that go. And so that's part of the reason why the Cetera Commission has been paused. So to this point, nothing has been canceled. So we're not out of compliance with anything. We've notified the province that we've paused, and we've done that in writing, and they've said, okay. We have also passed that information on to the federal government. So we're working collaboratively with those funding agencies. Our big concern is to keep funding. So we're doing what we can. So no matter what what unfolds, we're doing our best efforts to proactively preserve that. But yes, Cetera at this point has to do it.
All right. And then final question, at least for now, again, trying to sort of understand how this might work going forward. If, as a for example, and I'm not presupposing anything, if we ended up with a Colwood-Langford plant,
yes.
You talked about the design benefit capacity,
yes.
benefit. I can't remember which way around it was.
Yeah.
But so we have the kind of percentage formula that we're sort of looking at the moment.
Yes. Yeah.
But if those sort of inputs, if you like, expected inputs were to change, how does that then change the percentage formula and
yes.
And therefore the share, if you think of it like that, of any kind of federal and provincial grants that might be available?
Correct. That would change. There's a complete separation between who in the municipal or First Nation side is paying. The grant comes in based on submitting costs, and for those costs getting reimbursed for a share of those costs. So whether Colwood and Langford decided to do a plant and it was 50-50 or 75-25 or 40-60, that doesn't matter to the funding agencies. The costs get the cost sharing, not who's paying.
But it's the percentage that Colwood Langford is of the core area that becomes relevant.
That would actually be incorrect if Colwood and Langford did their own plant and it wasn't part of the rest. That would be a standalone plant.
Okay, but I guess I'm saying sort of within that framework, if there were a plant that was servicing just Colwood and Langford, then
when we looked at it before, we looked at it as a secondary project within the envelope. And so, although the cost sharing would have been, we would have, so if Colwood and Langford did a plant and everybody else was in another plant, we would have cost sharing for Colwood and Langford, and then everybody else would have cost sharing for that. Both of those projects would be within the program envelope, and so we would be submitting costs on those up to whatever limit. I can't speak for any discussion if the limits exceed what the total approved maximum is right now. But both parties have said both the feds and the province have said at this point they're not looking to increase the amount of funding. But yeah,
I understand that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lanny.
Yeah, I have a question. I assume that Langford and everybody else paid for a share of Viewfield and Harold Woods and Macaulay. So if we decided that we weren't going to go that route, Harold Woods, we would be able to sell that, the rest of the land that they're not going to use for the eastern trunk, and get some money back from that, and same with Macaulay and Viewfield. So I would assume that a portion of that money would come back to the west side for a plant that we wanted to do.
That would be correct. So if there's infrastructure as opposed to work, right? So if there's infrastructure that will transfer from the broad group to a subset, that would be transferred with a monetary value.
Okay, so that means that we would have more money than what we're showing here then, because we have a share in those three sites.
Yeah. Now Viewfield is a little different because Viewfield is not part of this project.
Okay.
So you're all in Viewfield, and Viewfield, right now you have no real cost because we've got a lease on it that would cover any temporary borrowing and more, and we're hoping to sell it or to lease it out again. So that's
there is
a little
a possibility then that if we decided we wanted our share out of Viewfield, that the other municipalities that want to keep Viewfield could reimburse us?
If there was I think that would be a political discussion for another day, because typically what we would do is it's an asset of the group, and on the accounting side it would stay within the group. So.
Anything further, Lanny?
No.
Thank you. Diana, just in terms of costs of properties, in terms of Harrow Woods, the value of what we've put into that, McLaughlin as well, and Viewfield.
Okay. Viewfield was $17 million plus some closing costs and realtor costs. We're hoping that we will be able to recover all of that one way or another, but it's at least $17.5 million, I think, for all of those costs. And as I say, they're not part of this project now. With regard to Harrow Woods, I'd actually have to go back because some of Harrow Woods, I can't remember if we actually went through with the transfer. There was some sales between solid waste and between Sanit and the project on that. So I'd have to look that up. And McLaughlin, I think, was 4 million and change, and so that would, if it was simply eliminated, then whatever revenue we're able to get from it would be shared by everybody. If it was used as part of a subset, then the sale would happen basically, and people who weren't in it would be reimbursed for their share on that. Now, if everything goes ahead, I've got no grant revenue in here because right now we don't have anything that is eligible for a grant. We haven't met any criteria for any grant. For most of those expenditures, but not all of them, that 39 million or so, they would be grantable, but at this point we don't have, they are not grantable today because we haven't met the basic criteria to be able to get all the agreements signed and get the working group in place and to start doing grant submissions.
Thank you. So just to be clear, the 39.5 million that has been spent, you're saying is not grantable, or it is grantable?
Today, if everything stopped today, we would be ineligible for any grants on that because we don't have the project that we got the grants for.
Yeah.
If we carry on and if the board ends up with a program that meets the criteria of the granting agencies, then we would throw these numbers into the grantable envelope and apply for grants on the parts within there that are eligible. Everything in there isn't eligible, but it's not huge numbers, and we have different criteria for what's eligible or not, depending on whether it's the provincial government or the federal government, and so we haven't calculated that out.
Thank you. And can I ask for clarity on which of these grants and agreements are secured?
The only, at this point the most security is with the provincial one, which is signed, but that is built around the federal one, and we were never going to get any money until at least a year after completion. So we're looking at 2019, 2020 to get any funding from the provincial government. The federal grants are not signed, and they still are acting as if that there will be a resolution, but there is nothing tied down on that, and we have not met the fundamental criteria to be collecting any funding on any of those 3 grants.
Okay, and thank you. Is there not something different about the Biosolids Energy Centre?
The Biosolids Energy Centre is a grant with 3P Canada. It requires a 3P project, and it is for a biosolids plant for the region. It might be okay if it was most of the region, but it is for a regional plant. My guess, but this is just my guess, I have no confirmation on this. My guess is that if the plant moved and was substantially the same, provided the same kind of environmental benefit, met the same kind of criteria, and that the federal government would eventually, or the 3P Canada would eventually sign off on that. Oh, yes. So with that particular grant, what we actually have is an agreement to enter into an agreement. So we have an agreement to enter into a financial agreement, and we had until the end of this month to ask for an extension. Otherwise, that grant expires the end of March next year, so in a few months. So I've got the consultant that we've engaged in Ottawa discussing that, and I'll be talking to 3P Canada this week. And in fact, we may end up having to do a trip out to Ottawa to sort of secure some of this. So we are expecting that they will look favorably upon that. And it's within that agreement to enter into an agreement that they actually have all of the criteria that were in the expected final agreement that would be signed, and that's what we have been working under. So to this point, CTERA have worked very hard to try and meet all of the conditions of the grant agreements with their procurement and their approach to all of the expenditures.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions? I'm looking to our consultants as well as staff. Anyone? John?
Could you clarify the flexibility in the federal granting and or the provincial granting with regards to specific sites like McLaughlin and Heartland? My understanding is that the provincial grant is tied to an approved liquid waste management plan, so that if the plan is amended and approved, it's still eligible for provincial funding. Is that correct?
Actually, the provincial grant wraps it. Okay. The provincial grant is built upon cost sharing the federal. If there is no federal, there is no provincial. So I wouldn't take a lot of comfort in how much definition there exists in the provincial grant itself, since it is inextricably tied to the federal grants, which have which have more specificity in them. So I did put on the summary page, we have up to $120 million for the construction of the McLaughlin Point wastewater treatment plant, marine outfall pipe, and completion of the Victoria Harbour crossing. That's federally. And then there's another $50 million for the upgrade of the Clover and Macaulay Point pump stations, implementation of attenuation tanks, upgrades to existing pump stations and piping systems. And then lastly, the Biosolids energy treatment facility for wastewater sludge, including 18 kilometers of pipes to carry the sludge. So those are quite specific on what they do. So there is no provincial grant without these grants.
But my question was two-part, though.
Yeah.
So that's answered the first part. The second part was, is there potential flexibility on the federal side to release funding without being applied to these specified sites and projects?
I do believe, it's 3 different grant programs, and 3P Canada would decide what, if anything, they want to do. There's a 3P Canada board that makes that decision, and they have their criteria, so no, I wouldn't for a moment assume that money would be available for anything else. I would not, I just cannot see, because of the way the funding's been put together, that money would pour it into building a sewage treatment, some more pipes somewhere, or another sewage treatment plant somewhere. That is the riskiest piece, because that's a 3P program. They're the ones that had the money for it. There was no Infrastructure Canada money for it. We would have had more flexibility if it hadn't taken so long, and if there had still been money in Infrastructure Canada to do their share. But as it is, we got not quite half. the money from the federal government, from Infrastructure Canada.
Anything further, John?
Yeah. Yeah.
Jim? And then I'll come to you.
Discussions regarding that funding and if it could change.
Regarding transferring that to a completely different project? No, and I would say this wouldn't be a good time to have those discussions because nobody wants to talk to us about a theory. They want to talk about a project. That's why there was no grant agreements until the senior levels of government believed that there was a firm project.
However, because you are having to enter into renegotiating that agreement within the agreement, those options would likely come up, would they not?
No, that is just to adjust the timing. It's back to the Minister and Cabinet and the 3P Canada Board in order to make any changes to that, any substantive changes, and that would. And in the opinion of the consultant, that would be a new grant if it was substantially different than building a biosolids plant.
Okay, it seems a little ridiculous to me that we would negotiate the same thing when we've already said this project isn't seeming to be following through. However, that will be something for CRD board to deal with. Sorry, go ahead, Christine.
I just want to be clear on the provincial money, that it is tied to receiving money from the federal government and approved liquid waste management plan. But it's not specific, from me reading it, to these specific grants as long as there's money coming from the federal government.
It isn't. It talks about I believe it talks about an energy center. It talks about treatment facilities, but it isn't quite as specific.
No. So, but if there was for things like energy centers and that, so I just want to be specific about that. And I'm sorry, Diana, when we met in the summer as a staff group, there were a lot of deadlines that were looming that we were about to miss and that would affect the funding and things like that. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that and what, if anything, has changed since I think we met in August.
The financial agreement deadline is in the in the sheet, and it has there November 2014. So we're expecting that we're able to extend that since we don't have a project to enter into the final agreement with, and that's what we're working on right now. And the issue with the other grants is working backwards. So there is a project completion deadline on the upgrades of Clover for January 31st, 2019. There is a project completion for the McLaughlin Point wastewater treatment plant of 2019, substantial completion a year before on both of those, and there is no funding from the province until the entire project is put together and has been operating as a unit and proves that it works. So that means for that since the last payment date to put in an application for funding for the federal government is January 31st, 2019. That means we're back a year from that, according to the engineers at least, in order to have things completed, in order to be able to do the commissioning and to have the CTERA Commission board chair, sign off that the laundry list of criteria that the province has been met as a result of substantial completion. So that's where the deadlines aren't so overt and obvious, but one has to work back on the construction times. And on the construction time for the biosolids plant, that program that is supposed to be operational by the fall of 2017 and finished all by the winter of 2018. And that doesn't mean November or December. That means by March 31st, 2018. So we're not going to meet that deadline. And so that's part of what we're negotiating on extending that. So because I'm not an engineer. The engineers say this is how much time they need to do those things, and we work backwards and go, we are up against a bit of a wall here.
Any other questions? Jim?
Just something off the grant side, but talking about the funding formula.
Yep.
So municipalities based upon the decisions with respect to the amount of flow they're going to purchase
Yep.
on certain assumptions that have changed significantly now. This planning process for the west side is based upon that funding formula. What's the possibility of and what's the process about going about changing that funding formula?
That particular the planning process here is outside of the CTERA project. So the funding that we have has been raised on that cost sharing. But if you're looking at doing something where you are substantially changing the inputs, the group who's involved can agree to adjust their pro rata percentages in the infrastructure that they're looking at, and we would make that adjustment on that. If the group doesn't agree, there is a provision in the bylaw to go to arbitration. And anyone who felt it was unfair and not meeting the terms could go to arbitration with that. So it's really it becomes a group issue to discuss.
And I have John.
The grants. So just hypothetically, say this group and an East Side group came up with an approved liquid waste management plan that was demonstrably more cost effective than McLaughlin Point, and was signed off by engineers and the board. Are you saying then that it would still be ineligible for the current set of federal grants?
If it was if it was a plant at McLaughlin Point?
No, not a plant. It was a plants out other than McLaughlin Point, but demonstrably more cost effective than the current plan.
Well, we would certainly have earnest and very strong discussions with the senior levels of government to point out what that would mean. I think I would hope that if there was a plan that was less money, that all parties would see the benefit of that and would be agreeable. The difficulty that arises is there are many municipalities now looking for funding for infrastructure. The FCM has been trying to build up a little more action on that. So it depends on how strong the federal desire is to be doing the funding here with a substantive change.
Any further questions? I'll entertain then a motion to table this to the next meeting so that people can. Thank you. Is there a seconder for that? Thank you. All those in favor? Any opposed? None. Motion's carried. Thank you very much, Diana. Okay, we have the update on public consultation strategy. Who's dealing with this?
I'm just going to lead it off. So based on our discussions last time, we have updated as just information piece both the framework and put together a communications and engagement strategy that gives a bit significantly more context to just what the boards are doing, and ties it in and more of a go-forward basis. I really want to recognize Sandra Russell from Colwood, who has led the development of the boards and acknowledge Richie and Kristen, who have put in a lot of work and got things done in record time. So we can have the general conversation. What we have for you to look at today, as well as just going through the boards, but to look at now how the questionnaire and the questions tie in to moving forward. This particular presentation is what we're looking at, the web-based presentation, but the substance of what's in the boards and that will be used in various different and hopefully effective venues and media to be able to access input from the greatest number of people of the public on the west side and perhaps beyond, to talk about what they want to look at and what they're looking for in a wastewater treatment facility and resource recovery. So I'm going to if there's no questions, I'm going to turn it over to Sandra and we can walk through it and then perhaps have the conversation after.
Thank you, Christine. So you have in front of you a paper copy of the information boards. So the intention of those is that in an open house setting, people would come and see these boards around the room. They would be supported by fact sheets, question and answer sheets, as well as WestSide representatives in the room, so generating conversations with people in the community. If you just want to flip through your sheets there, does everyone have something they can look at, I hope? So it goes through, and most of you have seen these boards before. The information hasn't changed too much. We talk about why have we invited you here today. So the purpose is to inform people about...
Sandra, just before you start, Councillor Hundleby, Linda Hundleby has a question. So,
thank you. I had some concern when I looked at the previous one, and I still see it here. There is something that raises a red flag because it's been drawn to my attention by residents and community members, and it's regarding the use of biosolids as compost. And I see it still here, and my understanding is that the CRD board had dealt with it, and so I see it coming up, and it's referenced several places. So I actually kind of wanted to look at that and get your feelings on that, because I think it's going to be, it could be a red herring for some people, and then it's going to throw it all out again.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. I think, though, that there are a number of places throughout the world, particularly in the States, where they do that, and I think people will have that question, and I think we need to have that conversation, allow that conversation to happen with people, if only to answer in that way. Christine?
I just want to say one of the principles that we have, Councillor Huddleby, is to ask the broadest questions we can. And if people are uncomfortable, we're thinking that will come out in the survey as well as coming forward. And we will be basing it on more of a methodology and being able to quantify as well as qualify the information. We, the people, we believe that it is important not to shut down the conversation before it starts, not making any assumptions about what people are going to answer on things, and hopefully the information we get back will then narrow things down to a point that we want that we have a more manageable and focused project moving forward.
Thank you. So I'm going to go, Sandra, I want you to go right through the whole thing so we don't get into the minutiae of it until we get to the very end, and then we'll have those discussions.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. So the process would be that people would come to an open house, they would look through the information boards, they would ask questions of the representatives there and look at the supporting information, and they would answer a survey. There would be either kiosks in the room where they could do that in an online format, or there'd be a paper version where people could fill it out right there, or they could take it home and do it later by either method. So that's what the first slide describes, is the process for the day. The second slide, which says number 1 on it, talks about why we're doing this now, because a suitable site has not been found yet. Which WestSide communities are participating, it shows them there. And that aligns with the question, I'll show you the survey in a moment, that asks what community people live in so that we can quantify that information. Slide 2, why is sewage treatment important? So the main reason is because we have to meet our legal requirement. The provincial and federal governments, of course, have mandated that sewage treatment must be in place in an environmentally responsible way. But we also want to invite people into the conversation about the fact that there might be other environmental or other potential benefits. So we've identified 3 of those: reducing our environmental impact, recovering resources, and ensuring value for tax dollars. And we have a question about that in the survey as well. The next slide is marked number 3, and it's about aspects of a sewage treatment facility. So what's important to you? And we hope people will picture their community and what it would be like if a facility was in their community, and what's important: no odor, hidden from sight, visually appealing, noise reduction, making it a multi-use facility that could include commercial and residential, also recreational space, minimizing trucking or transportation traffic, how the water is used, so to recharge groundwater, how the solids are used, composting, fuel sources, gasification, making it a resilient facility that is built to respond to climate change and climate events, recovery of heat energy, reclaiming water for toilet flushing and irrigation, for example, minimizing costs to taxpayers, generating revenue, and of course removing harmful materials. So those are some of the things we want people to think about. And in the survey, you'll see that they will be allowed to choose 5 of those options, their top 5. And from that, we'll start to create a recipe for a plan moving forward. The slide marked number 4 is one of those ones that we just want to give people a basic understanding of what we're talking about so that they can give their input in a somewhat informed way. So what's in sewage? And it's all the material that flows from buildings into sewage pipes, and some examples are listed there. We include some pharmaceuticals, some home things like cooking oils and carburetor food, and then industrial sort of things like heavy metals and commercial waste, just to show that there's a lot more in there, but to get people thinking about the wide range of things we're looking at treating. And of course, there would be a link to the CRD source control website where people can think about their responsibility and what goes into the sewage pipes. Slide 5 is just a high-level look at the sewage treatment process. It's a simplified version to give people an example of how it can work. It's not a definitive process. So wastewater flows from the sewer system into the treatment facility. Large debris is screened out and taken to the landfill. Most of the remaining solids drop to the bottom and are removed. Resulting liquid is often treated with microbes to break down any remaining solids. The wastewater may be disposed of at that point or filtered and disinfected to use for non-drinking uses. And then organic solids can be broken down further in a digester, resulting in treated solids. And there are certain processes that can happen there, such as creating biogas. Okay, slide 6 is about what could happen with the treated water, and there's a question associated with this one about which of these methods they might support. There are several options for disposing or reusing the water: disposing it through an outfall, into the ground if it's suitable and there's ministry approval for that, disposing treated water into freshwater lakes or streams, reusing the treated water for toilet flushing and other non-potable uses, or reusing treated water for irrigation. The following slide is similar, but it's about what could happen to the solids. And again, there are 2 pieces with this. Processing can be built into the sewage treatment facility, or they can be transported. So the first 3 options are about transporting. Either you can build a sewage treatment plant that will also process the fluids, construct a pipe to send it to another location, or transport it through other methods. And then treated solids have several potential destinations, including composting for use or sale, drying into pellets that could be used or sold as fuel, and processing solids using gasification or other methods. On to slide 8, it's just an introduction into the examples that follow. So we invite people to take a look at the design and cost and features of the following examples and start to think about what they could picture in their facility, in their neighborhood. So the following slides, there are 9 examples of various sewage treatment plants in other communities with several features. The three things we've tried to include for each example is the size of the site, the population it serves, and the cost of the project. We may need to do some more work on these examples to make sure that we're comparing consistent numbers and whatnot. And then it lists some key features about what some of these plants can do. So if you just want to scroll through, we have an example from Calgary. Dockside Green here in Victoria is the second one. Lighthouse Point in Blaine, Washington. Lot Regional Services in Olympia. Edmond City in Washington. Stevens Point is in Wisconsin. Henderson, Nevada. Columbia Boulevard in Portland, Oregon. And the last one is Brightwater, which is in Snohomish County, Washington. And the question you'll see in a moment that aligns with this is an open-ended question. Just what kind of benefits would you like to see if there was a sewage treatment facility in your neighborhood? There's a blank page following that. We have a reference map there. Where are the existing sewage trunk lines throughout our region? Number 11 we're on to. It's, again, that thinking of how might your community benefit from a sewage treatment facility. And slide 12 talks a bit about the next steps in the consultation process. So just getting across the idea that this survey and open house that they're attending is just one step in a longer process. And they'll have multiple opportunities to provide input. Also, off to the side there, you see we're at the same time we're gathering input from industry experts, other communities with successful facilities, and just extensive research. So that just to give folks the idea that just because they say what their preference is, that doesn't mean we're going with it. This is a large information gathering stage. Number 13 talks a little bit about steps in the process to give people the idea of some of the things Diana was talking about, the large number of approvals and processes that we need to go through. And this is just a small example of some of those to, bring the public on side about all the steps that we're going to need to go to. So identifying technology and sites, engaging the ministries, undertaking environmental impact studies, identifying partners and funding, finalizing sites and facility design, and commencing construction. And because we're so early in the game, we decided not to include dates alongside those because we're not quite there yet. And then a thank you and invitation to subscribe for more information and get in touch to provide more input. So questions, comments?
Thank you. Any questions, comments? To start off with, I want to thank you for the work that's been done here. It's a tremendous start, and I'll say that the one piece that's still missing for me that I want us to include is we need to look at this process and how do we do it differently than it was done before, because when it was done before, it was done with concern, suspicion, distrust, and so for us to go out and do exactly the same kind of process isn't going to bode well for really seeing that it's different, and we are different. This is a very different group. We want to go forward. We want to come up with a solution. I will say, with all respect to CRD, where right now we don't want to be seen as being bogged down and being part of an older process that really went sideways. So one of the to have just storyboards and open houses is going to very quickly be, in my mind, related to how processes came forward before. I would like us to see some sort of direct engagement with people as well. Roundtable discussion. It's worked very well in Esquimalt with respect to getting people to provide input on our economic development strategy. It certainly worked well with our policing and resolving that process. So how we include that, I think, is really important to getting directly to that person and them having a conversation so that ultimately we really do come up with some answers that aren't just individual, but they're collaborative. And that, in my mind, is how we're going to go forward with some good, solid information from the public. I'll invite other comments from other members of the committee. Judith.
Thank you. So first off, I love the way these boards are coming together. I don't actually have a copy of the questionnaire as well. That would be great to see that. I certainly remember seeing the earlier one. I've got a couple of nitpicky comments, but Sandra, I'll follow up with you after that. But I did just want to echo what the chair just said. I look at the slide 13 in terms of the next steps in the process. And as a member of the public, I look at we've got consult with communities up front, and then there's kind of an awful lot of stuff that happens, and then you get to consult with the communities again. And I really love Barb's idea around, is there a kind of an ongoing engagement piece? Because we know that this is a subject that kind of really gets people in this community excited. We know there's a lot of really well-informed people out there. How do we fully engage them in the process? And actually, I really like this kind of roundtable concept. So, I think all of us need to kind of put some more thought into that kind of what's that ongoing engagement piece. Whether it's a series of pods in the WestSide, whether it's kind of one WestSide piece that kind of might have sub-pieces happening underneath it, but that opportunity to engage the public, because otherwise I go, again, with due respect to the CRD, you're asking me all this lovely kind of fairly generic stuff up front, and then you go away and there's kind of a whole lot of discussion, including that nasty site word. And then you're going to come and tell me what my site options are. How do I, as a member of the public, how do I engage in that process going through so that I have an opportunity, and there's kind of there's going to be the people who don't want to be kind of hugely active, but they want the opportunity to kind of, okay, that's what's going on. I can look in on it. I can go back and read the notes. I can kind of do the kind of watchful eye piece, and then there are people who are going to want to be very actively involved in that process, and let's welcome that. And what is the wow?
That was
That's not
spectacular.
I hope that's not a comment. So what is the mechanism for those people who are really looking for that active engagement to kind of pop their heads up between the two orange bubbles and be engaged right throughout the process?
Other comments?
Oh, I was going to respond. Did you want me to respond?
Okay. I'll come to you, and then I'll go to Linda. Yeah.
Thank you. I like how this looks. I like the fact that there's no jargon in here, or minimal jargon. I like that there's diagrams. It shows, because there's people that are visual. So I think that this is really good. I certainly echo the chair's comments around how do we engage people, and the idea of the roundtable, I really do like. The only problem might be that you've got some people who have this much information and some who have this much information. So how do we marry that together? I think that's something that we do need to look at. The other thing I'd like to see is that we have regular updates to councils and then to the public, so that we can do that. And if I've come in the middle of the process and I want to know what's going on, and there isn't any sort of community consultation at that point, can I go to the website and see, oh, this is exactly where we are, this is what's happened, and this is what's going to be coming forward? I think that part is really good for people who may come in at different times of that and still not be left out. Thank you.
So just to clarify about the boards is the basis of information that we want the public to access, and we want to access them to access it in many different ways. We're kind of focusing on the open houses just because of timing issue. If we're going to get one under our belt, if not more than one, before the Christmas break, which is what staff's been concentrating on. But along with that is an interactive website that is being built at the CRD, which includes a resource library going forward. It is looking at approaching rec centers and other public venues within each community for the running slideshow to constantly engage people. You know, you're waiting or watching your child take a gymnastics lesson or something, that things are running in the rec centers and things like that to move forward, and encouraging people to contact us. Really happy to talk about what roundtables would look like and how we would use this information to be able to engage people even further. If you look at the communications plan, we have some ideas in there about how we can more actively encourage people to do it. And again, our general message, just to speak to it, and there's all kinds of ways that we would love to hear input, how to improve it, is that we want to get out is that the WestSide is seeking solutions, and we're seeking the public's opinion on what those solutions are. And if we have a key message moving forward, or the first thing out of the gate, that is the message that we're trying to, or we're hoping to be able to do. But it's about looking at these boards as the basis of the information in phase one that we want to get out, but sort of the methodology and the different methodologies, that is a really good conversation for more brains to have moving forward.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Jim, yeah. You want to respond?
Yeah. So we should go through the questionnaire, because it's not as you can't actually pick everything as important. We've been working with Royal Roads to try and get a more robust methodology, so people can't say everything's important. I take your point. It is why we have the examples in there, and we want to do like for like about how much things cost for people to look at. If there's a better way to connect those two things together, we'd be happy to do it. We're trying to address it in that way, and maybe Jim, after the questionnaire, and if you could think of a better way to connect or to make that point, because that's why we put the examples in with the price tag and things like that. We were trying to get people to think it isn't free, and this is what it might cost about things.
Thank you. John?
I just got a couple of questions, one tactical and one strategic. We've had a fair discussion this morning about federal provincial cost sharing, and this particular slide deck is totally silent on whether or not any of the sites in here would be eligible, and how would they be eligible for federal provincial cost sharing. Is that intentional, or because that to me would be a question on people's minds, and if I was coming to an open house, it would be one of the questions I would have. So I'm not quite sure how it's going to be addressed in here. So that's I'll go through my three questions. The second point is that back to the co-chair's point, that a lot of people were asking for a reset button following the situation with the previous direction, and it should be quite clear that this is in fact the reset button, and it is a totally different process. And what are the 4 or 5 characteristics that make it quite different from what had gone before, so that people are aware that this actually is a different approach. And the final question I have is on slide 13, when it comes to the overall timing. It would be useful to have a slide that indicated what the steps are in WestSide to get you from now to 2020 and a built system. And then you work backwards. So you have one set, which is between now and the end of March, where you do conceptual plans. A second part of that slide would be from March 15 to March 16, where you do some design. and detailed engineering, and then you're into construction and commissioning, and it kind of missing the broad direction of timing for this process. Thank you.
Thank you. Who will answer those questions?
I will. So that blank slide that you have in your package was the budget slide that we agonized over, and I've had 2 budget meetings trying to think about what we could put in there based on the information we have. And yesterday afternoon, we took the budget information out because of its complexity. Moving forward, hopefully, hoping that we would get more clarity today. We will take another stab at what that will look like. We just didn't. It was what we had up there was the total cost of what was before and what the federal notional share was, but we've heard all the caveats that go along with these things, so we will take another stab at it and maybe engage some of the CRD and some of the CAOs and trying to explain that fully. So our intent was that, and it's a hard thing to put on a board, and we were thinking that perhaps a much more comprehensive fact sheet really has to back that up because of the complexity of the situation that's there. I'm going to go on your overall timing too. We talked about dates. We're working with a March 31st deadline right now because of what was passed at the board, and we're trying to stay committed to that. But right now, our original dates moving forward, as you see in the framework, are slipping as we are now near the end of November, and we're still looking at the materials going forward. We're a little concerned about putting dates in. We're happy to put them into that slide going forward with things slippage, because the moment we say we're going to do something, and if we don't hit that deadline, if we put a deadline down, we lose our credibility, which is speaking to the point that this is different and we're going to do it different. We thought a more detailed what is going to happen next around approvals and impact assessments and all that would come out in phase 2 conversation when we had more specifics and we had narrowed down the conversation, so that the timelines or the next steps from a bigger point of view, like engaging the ministry in that, we thought to keep it, there's all these things involved with getting more specific when we go out for public engagement part 2. And then the reset button, we thought that we were trying to be as clear as we could without just overtly telling people, by the way, this is different, because in my experience, when you tell people it's different, they're look for ways that it's exactly the same. But we can look at that at the front end again to make sure that it's clear in the language at the very beginning of whatever we're doing that this is a new approach to being able to do this large project within the CRD.
Winnie.
And yeah, the answer is yes, but again, once we narrow it down, we could know right now it can be this big or this big, but after we get the first round of information and maybe that can be clearer, what we want to do is come back to you with options that looks at it on a household basis, depending on what option you want to go with. So that's sort of the narrowing down, and I think you're absolutely right. We can be clear about that.
Lanny.
I guess my only discomfort is probably slide 3, because there's a lot of things on here that, without putting a cost on them or without knowing what I know about this system, is that I would say, like, a lot of things I would say yes to, but then if you said to me, like, there's only a few communities that could take advantage of reclaiming the toilet flushing irrigation, and that has to be like I would say Royal Bay, because it's in its infancy. You could use the water there but a lot of the older houses don't have that infrastructure, and it would cost. The benefit would be far less, because the cost of putting that infrastructure in an old neighborhood would be really expensive. And so I have some. To me that would be a great idea. But then when you say, well, it's going to cost you X amount of dollars to do that, then you'd say, well, that's not so important to me anymore. And so there's some things on here that, without people understanding the cost of the infrastructure to be able to obtain that, would be something that maybe come off their list And I think when I was going door to door, to be honest with you, people were more interested in transportation than poop. Sewer wasn't a big issue on the door. They were saying, get me to work faster. I'm tired of this. So if you could have put them in their car and put them in a pipe, they would go for that. But they're not interested. Like most of the people said, you know what? Deal with the sewer and let's get it done. I'm not interested in the whole thing, but I don't want to pay a whole bunch of money for it. So let's find the best way to do it. Most of the people talk to me about, are you guys nuts? Why are you pumping sludge to Heartland Road? That was the big thing that came to me. And I said, well, we're kind of going away from that. Now we're looking at different ways. So that's kind of what I was hearing out there. But I have, like, it's like going down and buying a car, like the one that I think Toyota had a really good idea when they first came into the market. The first thing they did is it came with power windows, it came with power locks, and the whole car was one price. And the American car dealers weren't there yet. If you went to buy an American car, all that was extra, so it was added onto the price. Whereas if we came in and said, well, this is what you're going to get for this amount of money, but if you want this other stuff, it's going to cost you extra. And I think that's probably where people are at. Like, the bottom line is where most people are. They're saying, like, what is it going to cost in the end for my sewer?
I think what I'm hearing is that if we go to the survey, that helps to address some of those issues. So maybe if we can do that. I have Michael. Did I hear?
Well, I just wanted to say, from the technical point of view, that these things don't come in boxes on shelves that we know the price of, right? You can't go to Costco and buy any of this stuff. And if you look at the cost data on a large number of plants, and Richard Atwell's probably done the best work on this, the costs per liter for different types of treatment are all over the place. And there's no way that you can attach a cost to a particular type of treatment because it depends so much on your site and so many other factors that you design into your treatment plant, and factors that you don't have any choice over, such as the external piping that you need to get to your site, etc. So we could design a plant and give everybody the cost, and then we haven't asked them anything because we've already designed it. And I think you need to ask them the question. And the fact that they all tick, yeah, I'd like to have water recycled, doesn't mean to say everybody's getting it, because we all know, going through this process, that if it's going to be more than $780 million, there's going to be a hell of a lot of trouble. So nobody's aimed at that. Everybody's aimed at cheaper than that. And so we all know that the cost is going to have to be at least the same as or less than what they've been promised so far. But you won't know the prices on any of it until you actually see the bids, and before that you'll only still have a general idea. I would point out that the bids that CRD got were very different from estimates, in some cases a lot lower.
Thank you. I think we always have to reflect, too, cost comes in many different forms. And so different people will come forward with a different idea of cost. I'll pay more for environmental benefits. So leaving it broad at this time it allows us to have engaged that full discussion. And yes, dollars are going to come into it, absolutely. And but I would hate to see us do what we did at CRD, which was least cost option, which came to people in the form of dollars. And I honestly don't think we even followed that when we've ended up where we've ended up. So I think we have to be really careful not to presuppose anything, but have a way of going forward that gives that process full disclosure as you do go through it. I have Linda, and then I have Judith.
Thank you. So as I'm going through the examples, I see that the site sizes are quite broad. And I'm looking at the first one, 340 acres. So it seems like a lot of room. And, we're in our core area. And so how do we do that? I was hoping that we might find some examples that were more realistic for what we are. So that's just an observation. Do with it what you will, but I would rather see something that would be more realistic. Thanks.
Thank you. Any comments on that? I'll go to Judith.
Thank you. I actually just wanted to skip back to the previous conversation back on slide 3. And I like the fact that we are pushing the reset button and we're saying, back to the original question, what's important to you? One of the options that is down there on that list is minimizing cost to taxpayers. So if we're clearly hearing again and again and again that that's the most important thing, that's people's opportunity to say that's the most important thing. I think Michael said it very nicely. We don't know, it's not easy just to kind of say, well, that costs that much and that costs that much. I was very struck when we went to Seashelt. They told us about in fact, for them, moving to a sort of tertiary disinfected, like a higher level of treatment, actually in some ways cost them less money because it meant they didn't have to rebuild their outfall plant pipe. So it all depends, and it's not easy to say this costs this and this costs this. Until we kind of put this whole thing together, we don't know. But what we're trying to get out of this is cost the most important thing? That will help us to kind of move in certain directions. Or if maybe people are saying, hey, in this day and age, environmental treatment and resource recovery, cost is always going to be important. But, where's the balance in that? And what is it that people are really wanting us to achieve out of this whole process? That's what we're trying to get out of this. So I think, yes, it's useful to have the kind of the examples with all of the different costings and probably the different sizes, just as a way of saying there are a number of different ways of doing this. But I think if cost is important to people, they have an opportunity to tell us through this process. They also have an opportunity to tell us what the other things are. And yes, when we get closer and more realistic, we might be putting out there saying, if we go this, it is going to be more expensive. How do you feel about that? But we don't have the information to do that at this moment in time. Thank you.
Thanks. I just want to go back to page 5 and how is sewage treated? I see it as limiting some of the conversation by the diagrams, and I just want to, I know it's a high level. Is it the highest level that you can possibly go when you start talking about digester and treated solids as the little pile at the end? I worry because in my mind it takes us to a certain place. And so is there another way of capturing it that allows us to look at the new opportunities, the different opportunities of how biosolids end up that diagram bothered me last time. It still bothers me, and I know it will give problems. Jeff?
Chair, while the diagram is kind of prescriptive, it is
Under.
It is somewhat the basis for most treatment systems. There are variations as we go into different types of technology, but the problem is the technologies vary so much. Again, this is not something you just go buy off the shelf. The simplest way, if we were going to try to explain this, was you have dirty water with big chunks of stuff in it, and at some point you have clean water with very small chunks of stuff in it. However, when we look at our audience we're going to be dealing with, again, we have some that are very well educated on this subject and some that aren't. And we have to provide a little bit of both to each group. For the ones who don't quite understand it all, this is a very simplistic way of trying to explain something like you see on slide number 1 that Calgary has, that large of facility. And it's also a way to explain what Dockside Green also has. For those who have a little bit more, they're going to take a look at this and say, yes, you guys have simplified it, but what about this in particular? And then at that point, the technical experts, for lack of a better term, on the west side can engage those individuals on a more technical level discussion and answer those questions. Again, it's just a starting point to discuss what wastewater treatment is, because to most people, it is, I flush a toilet and it goes away, and I don't worry about it after that. So,
Okay.
again, it's a way of trying to get us to a common point.
Okay, my worry is that I don't see gasification in that diagram in any way, shape, or form, and so that is an option. It's a different option, and it's certainly becoming more prevalent. So how do we make sure that those kinds of discussions occur? And what I'm hearing from you is there is an opportunity to have those discussions, but I'm also hearing that it requires that roundtable engagement type of strategy that we need, that we're all saying that we'd really like to have. So as long as that's included in some way, I'll be okay. But I know this is going to come to us in some way, that people are going to look at that, those who have maybe more knowledge, and say, why would we, why are we, that's not the way to go. So it is a discussion, but to me, it indicates we still need that roundtable component. The other question I have for everybody is, and I don't know how we get around this, is that we are, we're trying to do something and say, this is a reset, this is different, this is WestSide. And on our last page, all of the information is coming back in some way to CRD. It's not coming to our communities necessarily. And I think that's going to be perhaps, it needs to come to CRD. We are part of CRD, but how do we do it such that it's our communities, that we're doing something different, that it's the west side, and just having us tacked on /WestSide, I don't think is enough.
So if it's a decision of the committee, we have done a domain search, and westside.ca is available if we want to reserve it for the whopping cost. I think it's $18 to have a separate website if that's the desire to go forward. So,
And that would include a link from everyone. I'll go to you, Larissa.
Thank you. Yeah. We had discussions the last I was involved with having this linked back to the CRD for a number of reasons. The CRD is responsible for the liquid waste management plan, as the Minister of Environment has indicated in her letters. We're responsible for pulling the funding together. The service, the WestSide is still part of the core area liquid waste service, which is a service of the CRD. And my sense of it is that we certainly can have everybody's logo included on the materials, and we have linkages from all of the websites, from the individual municipalities through to the CRD/WestSide website. But my feeling is that we can't lose the connection with the CRD's role overarching this project. So for what that's worth.
So does that include or discount a separate domain name, which I really don't know a lot about? But
at this point, this website is connected to the CRD, which links back to all of the other work and all of the other pieces that will support this work that the CRD is providing. I think if you create a separate website for WestSide, you're going to lose that connection back to the agency that's responsible for delivering the solution, which is at the end of the day the Capital Regional District.
Okay. So my comment would be, let's work together, staff, and see what we can do that makes this more separate, and with Larissa in terms of what she requires. But I would like to see it more separated, still saying it's part of CRD and still having that access, but we only have one chance at this. Only one chance. And we have to do it right. I'm going to go to Linda and then Judith, and then what I'd like to do is quickly take us to the survey and wrap this one up.
Thank you. So I understand Larissa's point. So that is not as much of a problem for me. When I look at number 3, and this might tie into the survey, but it really depends, if I was to fill this in, depends on the site. So if it's going to be down the block from me, then the idea about no odor and visually appealing is going to be more important. But if it's on the other side of the community or in another municipality, hidden from sight isn't really going to bother me. It's going to be hidden from me anyway. So when we do the survey, does it give some kind of context as to where you actually sit?
I think that it does. I'm just trying to remember the exact wording of the question. We'll see in a moment. But I think it does. And if it doesn't, it should be saying something like, if a sewage treatment facility was built in your neighborhood, what would be important to you?
Yeah. Okay, Judith, and then we'll try and whip through the survey. We want to move this forward.
Just a quick comment on the WestSide domain name. I think we can have our cake and eat it too. I think we can have a westside.ca domain name in the same way we had a wastewater made clear domain name, which kind of takes you back to that hosted site, which you can also link to directly from the Esquimalt site, the Langford site, the Colwood site, etc., etc. So it makes it shorter and quicker for people to go to, gives it a bit of its own identity, but also keeps the...
Thanks. Okay, Sandra, rip through this so that we can give you some decisions so you can get on with it.
Okay, so it's a really quick survey, and it will look similar to what we've seen in the slides, because we've the idea of this survey is that someone could do it online. They could click to it on whatever website they're on, so any of our municipalities or the CRD site, or they may have a link to it in a tweet, or they may come across this with no other background whatsoever. So the idea is that we've incorporated some of the boards we've been talking about. There's a short introduction there. Here's our welcome board that shows all of the municipalities that are participating and First Nations. We see here the first board. Why are we talking about this now? And here it says, in which municipality do you live, own, or lease property? And here's a drop down so that people can pick which municipality or First Nation they live or own land in. We've also asked the question, is your home or business on septic or sewer? Because we think that'll be informative going forward. So we've got septic, sewer, I'm unsure, and a space for other in case they have a business as well as a home, different situations. Next slide, same as people would see in an open house. Why is this important? And then we've asked people to rank their first, second, and third priority. So is environmental your first priority? Is keeping costs low your first priority? You can see here that you can only choose one first priority, and a second, and a third. So they're limited in that way. So is it environmental, is it keeping costs low, or is it resource recovery interests? Next is our contentious what's important to you slide. This one says you can only choose 5 of the options. So these are identical to what you see on the board. And if you can see at the bottom, you may not be able to see, it's quite small there. This, of course, would be done on a home computer or a handheld device, so it'll be right in people's faces. But you can only pick 5 options, and at the bottom it's counting the maximum number. There's 5 and showing I've got 3, I've got 4. They won't be able to proceed if they choose more than 5. And then there's an open-ended question again. What other things or what other concerns do you have? Just to provide input of all kinds on that topic. Yes, it is. Yeah. So what could happen to the treated water? This is identical to what will be shown at the open house as it finally ends up. And then there are 3 options for people here. I would support this method. So for example, an ocean outfall, I would support it, I would not support it, or I'm unsure about this method. And so they can answer that for all 5 options. And the same thing happens for the solids. It's the same slide people would see in an open house, and they'll answer I would support, I would not support, I'm unsure about this method. Yeah.
So just some of the concerns, right? Like if it's land application, if the overwhelming response we get, we do not support composting, that is something tangible that we can take back just to speak to the concerns about the different things.
Then we move on to our example slides, and so again, they're all here. It's a lot of information for people to digest, but we want to include it for those who are interested. And at the bottom is an open-ended question. And so, Linda, to your question, these innovative sewage treatment and resource recovery facilities in other areas have demonstrated many community benefits. What benefits would you like to see if it was a facility built in your community? So hopefully that hits your point. And that's it. We have a final open-ended question. Do you have any other additional comments or suggestions? And our thank you board. So keeping it brief and hopefully doable for people, and hopefully providing enough background information. Of course, they would link, this would be hosted on a number of sites that would link back to the resource library and all sorts of other information.
Thank you. I'm going to look to people to see whether it has actually answered some of those concerns that were brought up earlier. I'm seeing nods.
Can I just ask a question in terms of the survey itself? So is there an idea that we would have the survey at the open houses to people, so people would fill in, so they'll have a multi-page document that they're walking around with?
Yeah, I'm actually thinking a trifold sort of a thing that's a bit of cardstock, so it's nice enough to write on.
Okay, so small enough that they could do. Okay.
As well as we're hoping to have computer kiosks, so if people want to do it, because our preference is that people do it online, it'll be much easier to bring together, digest the information, that at the open houses there will be the opportunity to use one of the laptops and do it online if you don't have your own handheld device.
Thank you. Any further discussion on this? I'd like to entertain a motion to go forward. Judith.
So I would move the staff recommendation with a couple of minor adjustments. So that the WestSide Wastewater Treatment and Resource Recovery Select Committee approve the consultation strategy as presented and discussed at the November 18th meeting, with the addition of community roundtables and a standalone domain name, and direct staff to begin engaging WestSide communities.
Thank you. Is there a seconder to that motion?
So basically it's as presented, except I referenced today's meeting, and with the addition of community roundtable and a standalone domain name.
So what we've done is, or what Judith, it sounds like Judith's doing is being inclusive of the discussion we've had today. I'm looking for a seconder to the motion. Lanny? Discussion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Motion is carried. Any, I should have said any opposed. Motion is carried. Thank you. Okay, quickly we have new business. Larissa has an update on what's happening on the other side of the bridge.
Yes, thank you. I'm sure there's lots going on. I did just have a brief voicemail from Mr. John Sturdy of the City of Victoria yesterday. He has engaged consultants to help with the City of Victoria study. Urban Systems and KWL are working with the city, and they're only just getting underway with their business case analysis, so they're not as far ahead as maybe we may have anticipated, so that work is just underway.
Thank you.
And I don't have an update from Senator Oak Bay at this point.
Thank you. Any questions regarding that? All right. Was that you? No, the other part of new business would be how we resolve to go forward with media and press releases, and as well as we have still to do the communication to the minister. And we did have an understanding that we would continue to do our own letter to the minister. In terms of media, I would suggest, from the discussion that we've just had, that we're continuing to want to see some uniqueness to WestSide as a group. And so it would be my suggestion, committee that if you're interested, that we ask communication staff from our communities to work with CRD to come up with a way that we can present this as a more unique process. In the last week, there was to be a press release coming out of CRD. We didn't have the comfort with going in that route at that time. So I'd like to just have further discussion amongst staff to see whether there's a way of bringing this whole process to that slight separation, but still with CRD that we're looking for with that domain name as well. So if you're comfortable with that, I think we'd just give that as direction to staff. I'm seeing heads nod, so we're okay with that. All right. We're now going to move in camera in accordance with the Community Charter, Part 4, Division 391E, the acquisition, disposition, or expropriation of land or improvements if the board considers that disclosure could reasonably be expected to harm the interests of the regional district. This is really just conveyance of information that the CRD board allowed to go out to councils, and we felt it would be needed here as well. I'll turn to Larissa.
Yes, thank you. Just before we go into camera, I just wanted to provide an update to the group that the Technical and Community Advisory Committee, so that's a technical and public advisory committee that's in place to review and work with us on liquid waste management plan amendments, is holding a meeting next week, November 27th. There's a couple of members here, Jeff Miller and Michael Baxter, are members of that committee, and I'll be looking to those folks, hopefully, to present an update on what's happening with WestSide. I'm not going to be in attendance at that time, so that's just something so that we can demonstrate to the province that we've meeting their requirements to move through an amendment process. So I wanted to bring that to everybody's attention.
Thank you, and you reminded me of the discussion. There's one more item before we go in camera, and that is the discussion that occurred at the last Core Liquid Waste meeting with respect to the WestSide Committee. And I can't find the information you gave me, including the reference to, here, I'll just read it out so it makes more sense. The motion, a motion came to the floor at the Core Liquid Waste Management Committee in that the WestSide terms of reference represent a sub-regional approach to sewage treatment be incorporated under the Core Area Liquid Waste Management Plan, and given the existing capital works invested, that the WestSide plan shall include consideration of the catchment area now served by Macaulay Point plant. It is that last part of the motion that I want to draw your attention to, because it was brought forward at the Core Liquid Waste Committee without sort of a reference to it here at the committee. What it does is it allows the second pipe that comes down in through Esquimalt, which may include Saanich, what may include Victoria, to be brought into our process should we feel we need to have that discussion, should they feel they need to have that discussion. So I wanted just to bring this to the committee's attention to make sure that there was no concern about that going forward. We actually all were sitting at the table there other than our alternates, so I think it was important. And Ken as well, which will soon be at the table. So I wanted just to make sure that you were okay with that caveat being added. It didn't pass, as I'm remembering. It was the amendment be postponed because there were a number of discussions with respect to what's happening on the east side. Of course, it was pre-election. So it needs to go back, but we felt that it added a broader opportunity to continue under the CRD umbrella and to provide opportunity for other communities to come together with us. So if I don't hear any concern, then I will assume that the chairs can then move forward with that at the time when it comes back to committee. And Ken, we can certainly have further dialogue should you require any more information on it. And anyone else. Okay. All right, good. Now we can move, if I can get a motion to move in camera based on the section of the community charter that I read. Seconder, please. Thank you. Yes. We'll take a 1 minute bio break. How's that? We're not going to be long, guys. Where is the bio break?
Would you like the taping to continue to be in camera, or should it be off?
No, it should be on. Thanks. Oh,
Yes, sir.